The tank never saw it coming. A T-72, apex predator of Soviet armored warfare, crawled up the side of a ridgeline near the Kuwaiti border. Its 125mm smoothbore cannon swept the horizon as its diesel engine growled. In its hardened steel shell sat 3 men, confident, well-trained, convinced of their vehicle's invulnerability. The tank had ERA, explosive reactive armor. It had survived airstrikes before. It had outgunned American Sheridans and outrun Iranian chieftains. But what none of them saw, what they couldn't have seen, was the silent shape lying 2 kilometers away beneath a khaki tarp and desert netting. The launcher tube emitted no sound. The missile snaked upward into the sky, riding a barely visible wire, adjusting course in mid-air. 45 seconds later, the tank was a plume of flame and twisted armor. That sound, fsht-toom, marked the beginning of a new kind of battlefield terror. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't air power. It was a single missile carried by a crew in a Humvee or slung over a Marine's shoulder, launched without warning from positions invisible to Soviet optics and radar. The BGM-71 TOW wasn't supposed to change the rules of land warfare. But it did. Soviet commanders who had once laughed at Western infantry toys now found themselves scrambling for answers. Their greatest weapons, T-64s, T-72s, even the formidable T-80, were being picked off before they could even fire a shot. Reports streamed in. Iraq's armored columns melting under American missiles in 1991. Syrian T-72s erupting in plumes of smoke during ambushes in the Bekaa Valley. Videos surfacing of rebel fighters in Syria using surplus TOWs to destroy Russian export tanks with surgical precision. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to them. Not to Soviet armor. But it had. And behind every explosion was the same unassuming name, printed in small white stencil on an olive tube. TOW. Tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided. In a war built on steel giants and thunderous cannon fire, this one missile whispered a simple truth. You don't need a tank to kill a tank. In the early 1970s, deep inside the corridors of Soviet military intelligence, Western weapons were being studied, classified, and, in many cases, dismissed. Among them sat a file with little urgency, thin, unremarkable, containing brief reports on a new American anti-tank system, the BGM-71 TOW. The consensus was swift, not a serious threat. To Soviet planners, real anti-tank capability came from speed, massed artillery, and heavy armor. If the Americans needed shoulder-fired weapons to stop tanks, it meant their tanks weren't good enough. The TOW, to their minds, was just an advanced recoilless rifle, a longer-range version of the bazooka. Dangerous in ambush, perhaps, but no match for a T-64 charging at full speed or a T-72 with composite armor. Their wargame simulations reflected this belief. They projected ATGM operators being overrun, spotted by reconnaissance drones, or outpaced by armored thrusts. They assumed NATO forces lacked the cohesion to deploy these systems effectively. One Soviet analyst quipped, "If they bring missiles to a tank fight, they've already lost." And so the TOW system was filed away, not as a paradigm shift, but as a footnote. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that the TOW was never designed to play by their rules. While the Soviets built doctrine around overwhelming force and strategic depth, the Americans were learning to fight smarter, not harder. Vietnam had taught brutal lessons about mobility, concealment, and the price of underestimating light infantry. The TOW was born from that chaos. It was never meant to slug it out in open battlefields with tanks head-on. It was meant to lurk, to watch, to wait. It was built for forests, hills, deserts, and city corners, where the terrain broke up tank formations and gave the hunter time to aim. But to the men in Moscow, none of that mattered. They saw the future of land warfare through the lens of Kursk and Berlin. Waves of armor, overwhelming artillery, a crushing push to the Rhine. They didn't believe that a missile launched by 2 men behind a bush could stop that. They believed in mass, in numbers, in shock. But as the years would show, brutally, repeatedly, they believed wrong. Because the TOW wasn't just a missile, it was a message. Your tanks are not untouchable anymore. For decades, Soviet land warfare was built on one unshakable pillar: the armored offensive. Massed tank columns, backed by motor rifle regiments and artillery batteries, were the spearhead of Soviet military doctrine. If NATO ever dared to challenge the Warsaw Pact in Central Europe, the Soviet response would be immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of tanks sweeping across the Fulda Gap, smashing resistance under treads and 125mm cannon fire. It was a war of momentum. One of speed and volume. The theory was simple. Keep pushing. Keep moving. And never let the enemy set up a defense. The tank would always be faster than the gun waiting for it. In that vision, small anti-tank teams were an inconvenience, annoyances to be bypassed or flattened by indirect fire. Infantry with shoulder-launched rockets couldn't stop a blitzkrieg, and fixed positions were vulnerable to artillery. Only a tank could kill a tank reliably. That was the truth hammered into every officer's head. But something was happening in the West. Something that Soviet planners were watching, but not fully absorbing. American forces weren't just fielding new tanks like the M1 Abrams. They were building layered defenses, an interlocking web of systems designed to stall, bleed, and then annihilate advancing armored units before they ever reached the front. At the heart of this web sat the TOW missile. No longer just a tube in the hands of infantry, the TOW was being mounted on jeeps, Humvees, helicopters, and soon the M2 Bradley. It became modular, able to fire from static positions or moving vehicles, on short notice from hidden locations. It had reach, and most importantly, it had lethality. At ranges up to 3,750 meters, it could strike before most Soviet tanks could return fire. It could punch through armor from an angle they weren't designed to defend. And it could do it with chilling accuracy, even in the hands of a 2-man team dug into a trench or bunker. The implications were devastating. In the war the Soviets were preparing for, tank battalions were supposed to punch through enemy lines in hours, not be delayed, bled, and immobilized by invisible killers hiding in tree lines or village ruins. But the TOW threatened to do just that. And the doctrine, the momentum, the fury, the entire belief system of the Soviet armored thrust had no answer. It couldn't suppress all the launchers. It couldn't outrun the missiles. And once a column bogged down under fire, the rest was vulnerable to airstrikes and artillery. The Soviet army had built a hammer, but the Americans had built a trap. And soon that trap would spring. It happened in 1972, near the remote edges of the Central Highlands in South Vietnam. The U.S. Army, nearing the end of its direct involvement in Southeast Asia, decided to test something new. Amid the thick jungle canopy, against an adversary well-versed in ambushes and mobility, a crew prepared to launch a weapon most had never seen in real combat. It wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a mine. It was a boxy tube mounted on a light platform, tracking an unseen enemy. The BGM-71 TOW was about to fire its first shot in anger. Across the valley, 4 M41 Walker Bulldog tanks, armored reconnaissance vehicles supporting North Vietnamese forces, moved cautiously between the trees. They were light, fast, and armored just enough to survive small arms and recoilless rifles. They expected resistance. They expected maybe an RPG. They did not expect what came next. The TOW missile ignited with a subdued hiss, trailing a wire as it snaked toward its target. The missile, maneuvering mid-air through subtle joystick inputs from the gunner, arced gracefully across the jungle clearing and struck the lead tank square in its front hull. There was a flash, a thunderclap, and then silence. Observers watched in awe as the explosion ruptured the tank's armor, sending debris flying and immobilizing the rest of the column. Seconds later, a second missile launched. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within minutes, 4 tanks lay burning in the mud, each destroyed by a missile guided from over 2 kilometers away by a crew that never moved from cover. The jungle had swallowed the killers, but the damage was permanent. This first battlefield use of the TOW, though limited in scope, marked a seismic shift. U.S. military planners understood immediately. This wasn't just a tank killer. It was a force multiplier, a way for light units to destroy armored threats without needing supporting tanks of their own. Word reached Pentagon channels quickly. The Army, which had long sought an effective counter to massed armor without relying on costly air support, saw the future. But halfway around the world, in the halls of Soviet military academies, the news barely registered. The North Vietnamese had lost 4 light tanks? It was barely worth a mention. They had no idea the TOW had just entered the game. Because what the Soviets didn't realize, what they couldn't see from their lens of heavy armor superiority, was that this wasn't about firepower. It was about range. It was about invisibility. It was about killing a tank before it even knew it was in danger. And this jungle trial, overlooked by Moscow, was just the beginning. As footage of burning tanks circulated through Pentagon briefings and classified NATO assessments, a parallel reality played out in the corridors of Soviet command. They didn't believe it. Reports of American infantry destroying armored targets from thousands of meters away, using wire-guided missiles deployed by light vehicles or concealed squads, were treated with skepticism. Not because they hadn't heard of the TOW missile. They had. But because it didn't fit their worldview. In Soviet thinking, only tanks could reliably kill tanks. Anything else was an opportunistic weapon, something used by insurgents, irregulars, or desperation units. A missile fired by a soldier crouched in a foxhole was not supposed to be able to destroy a main battle tank protected by reactive armor, composite plating, and decades of design optimization. And yet, the data kept coming. Satellite imagery from Middle Eastern conflicts showed lines of destroyed armor, their turrets blown skyward. Signal intelligence intercepted from U.S. allies referenced TOW platforms coordinating in hunter-killer teams. Combat simulations in West Germany were beginning to factor in missile ambush zones as credible tank deterrents. Still, Moscow insisted the TOW was limited, vulnerable, and obsolete in real combat. Analysts pointed to its wire guidance, claiming that any ECM or rough terrain would disrupt targeting. They mocked the requirement for visual tracking, assuming the operator would be too exposed or easily spotted. They dismissed battlefield losses as export model weaknesses, blaming poor crew training or outdated armor. After all, no NATO country had ever fought the full might of the Soviet army. Real war on European soil would be different, so they doubled down. T-72s and later T-80s were deployed with newer armor packages. ERA bricks were layered onto hulls like talismans. Their own ATGM programs accelerated, emphasizing tandem charges and higher speeds. And as far as the Kremlin was concerned, TOWs were still relegated to the second tier. Dangerous, perhaps, but only in niche scenarios. They ignored one fundamental truth. The battlefield had changed, and TOW was already adapting faster than they could account for. In war games run by NATO in 1980 and 1981, TOW teams repeatedly disrupted Soviet-style armored assaults. In some simulations, entire battalions were delayed or rendered combat ineffective by a single ambush along a tree line or valley corridor. And while Soviet observers noted the data, they interpreted it through an outdated lens. This only works because it's not real. But it was real. And every year they refused to believe TOW. Operators got faster. Their optics got sharper. Their range extended. Their missiles grew deadlier. By the time Moscow accepted the TOW as more than a footnote, it was already too late. The weapon they refused to fear was already rewriting the rules of war. At the core of Soviet overconfidence was a dangerously flawed theory that armor alone would outpace evolving threats. The T-64, the T-72, and the later T-80 were the pride of Soviet engineering. Their thick frontal armor, compact silhouette, and powerful 125mm smoothbore gun were designed not only to withstand traditional threats, but to dominate the battlefield in both speed and firepower. Backed by reactive armor blocks and low profiles, these tanks were hailed as the zenith of Eastern armor, unbeatable on paper and terrifying in formation. Soviet military engineers believed that high-velocity shells, kinetic penetrators, and point-blank armored duels were the future. Anti-tank missiles like the TOW, with their relatively slow subsonic speed and visual line-of-sight limitations, were considered outdated the moment they were fielded. A missile that took 20 to 25 seconds to reach its target from maximum range? That was plenty of time, they thought, for a tank to engage and eliminate the threat. This led to a series of false assumptions. First, that the TOW operator would always be visible and therefore vulnerable. Second, that battlefield conditions, smoke, jamming, terrain, would interfere with missile guidance. Third, that the tank's mobility and optics would allow it to detect, maneuver, and fire before the TOW could complete its flight. None of these proved true in practice. What Soviet commanders failed to grasp was that the battlefield environment was evolving, and the Americans were designing for it. TOW launch crews were trained to fire from defilade, natural or urban cover that exposed only the launcher, not the operator. Newer TOW platforms were vehicle-mounted, allowing for quick relocation immediately after launch. And most critically, U.S. forces stopped treating anti-tank missiles as isolated tools. They became part of interlocking kill zones, supported by artillery, drones, and air power. The TOW didn't need to win a duel. It needed to ambush, disrupt, and destroy before detection. Even the wire guidance system, mocked by Soviet analysts, turned out to be an advantage. It was immune to jamming, impervious to most countermeasures, and far more accurate in low visibility conditions than expected. In the hands of a trained crew, it could strike moving targets with pinpoint accuracy at nearly 2.5 miles. As newer variants like the TOW-2 and TOW-2A emerged, armed with improved warheads and tandem charges designed to defeat ERA, the Soviet design logic began to unravel. The armor that was supposed to protect the tank, instead, became a liability. Extra weight slowed maneuverability. Larger silhouettes meant easier targeting. And reactive armor, though effective against simple heat rounds, offered little resistance to top-attack profiles or tandem penetrators. The TOW wasn't just catching up. It was outpacing tank design entirely, and the longer the Soviets clung to their old theory, that protection and firepower alone would preserve armor dominance, the more devastating their battlefield losses would become. The TOW was no longer a footnote. It was a force multiplier, a doctrine killer, and worst of all, a weapon that proved you didn't need a tank to kill the best tank Soviet engineers could build. If the first mistake was underestimating the TOW's capability, the second was far more dangerous, believing that tanks could always recover and retaliate after taking a hit, or at least survive long enough to fire back. Soviet doctrine viewed battlefield damage as a constant. Tanks would be hit. Crews might suffer casualties. But the assumption was that their armored behemoths, particularly the T-72 and T-80, could endure one or more direct strikes and remain combat effective. This belief stemmed from a deep confidence in ERA, explosive reactive armor, compact turret design, and the low silhouette of their tanks. It was further reinforced by propaganda films and Red Army exercises that showcased tanks shrugging off hits, returning fire, and winning the day. That assumption would cost them dearly. What Soviet planners failed to factor in was the kinetic chain of destruction that TOW missiles inflicted. These weren't glancing blows or track-breaking side strikes. They were catastrophic penetrations, slicing through armor, setting off ammunition stores, and igniting fuel compartments in milliseconds. In many cases, there was no chance to return fire, because there was no one left alive in the tank to do it. This was especially true for Soviet autoloader systems, which stored ammunition in a carousel beneath the turret floor. A single penetrating hit could detonate the entire load, causing the turret to blow sky high, a phenomenon that would later become infamous in Chechnya, Syria, and Iraq. Western soldiers gave it a grim nickname, the Jack-in-the-Box effect. The TOW exploited this flaw mercilessly. Even worse, the Soviets clung to the belief that tank columns, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery, could overwhelm missile teams before they could do real damage. In reality, however, TOW teams struck before the battle even began. From 2 kilometers away, they could engage targets without revealing their position. In many encounters, tank crews never knew they were under attack until it was too late. And when tanks did survive an initial strike, they often became paralyzed, not just physically, but tactically. Damaged tracks meant immobility. Damaged optics meant blindness. Command breakdowns meant hesitation. In combined arms warfare, even a few seconds of confusion was enough for U.S. forces to finish the job, with air power, artillery, or a second missile. This was not a fight the Soviets were ready for. They had trained for frontal engagements, for rolling offensives, for tank-on-tank duels that echoed World War II. But now they were facing a battlefield without symmetry, where a hidden two-man team could kill $1 million armored asset from across a valley. And even when their tanks fired back, when they rotated turrets, adjusted elevation, and locked on, they found nothing. No visible target, no flash, no sound. Just a smoking crater where their comrades had stood seconds earlier. The Soviet answer to the TOW was to build heavier, faster, better armored tanks. But they never asked the right question. What if the tank is no longer the answer at all? In the war rooms of Soviet military intelligence, the TOW missile remained a curiosity, tracked but never truly feared. Even as NATO exercises revealed shifting doctrines and battlefield videos emerged of tanks burning from unseen launches, Soviet analysts stayed anchored in tradition. They gathered specs, logged deployment numbers, monitored export patterns, but missed the one thing that mattered: how the TOW was actually being used. They knew it existed. They cataloged its speed, range, and payload. They even noted upgrades like the TOW 2A and tandem warheads. But to them, it was still a foot soldier's weapon, one that, with proper armor and doctrine, could be marginalized. That analysis failed to capture the truth that the Americans and their allies had internalized. The TOW was no longer a niche tool. It had become central to modern combined arms warfare, not as a backup system, but as a primary method of stopping armored thrusts cold. Soviet doctrine had long emphasized deep battle theory, layers of maneuver, shock, and massive armored breakthroughs. Intelligence officers assumed NATO would react conventionally: tanks against tanks, artillery against artillery, battalion against battalion. But the battlefield NATO was building looked different. It was asymmetric, agile, and deeply lethal. American and West German units were embedding TOW launchers into everything, from jeep-mounted strike groups to mechanized infantry carriers like the M2 Bradley. A single U.S. infantry platoon could now engage armored columns from ambush points, retreat, and reposition, all without ever revealing their full presence. These tactics were rehearsed and refined in NATO exercises. Red flag simulations showed TOW units not just delaying, but defeating advancing armor. Blue Force units in the Fulda Gap war games routinely dismantled Soviet-style assaults using layered TOW fields backed by A-10 Warthogs and artillery. Some scenarios ended with 70% of enemy tanks destroyed before they could even engage. Soviet observers saw these war games. They took notes, but they interpreted the data through a warped lens. Rather than reassessing their assumptions, they doubled down, blaming unrealistic simulation rules, biased referees, or the absence of full-scale Warsaw Pact tactics. In private memos, they argued that no real armored unit would ever allow itself to be flanked so easily, or NATO terrain assessments are based on false mobility assumptions. In effect, they filtered reality through doctrine instead of letting doctrine respond to reality. Even Soviet advisors embedded in proxy conflicts, like those in Syria or Iraq, often downplayed the performance of TOW systems when tanks were lost. Losses were attributed to operator error, terrain disadvantage, or Western propaganda. It was easier to believe a battlefield had failed than to accept that the tank was no longer king. The result? By the time the Soviet Union began fielding more sophisticated counter-ATGM systems, the battlefield had already moved on. TOW launchers had grown faster, smarter, and deadlier. And the West had built an entire strategy around hiding, waiting, and killing from range. The intelligence wasn't absent, it was simply ignored. And when the tanks started burning for real, not in exercises or foreign wars, but in battles the Soviets couldn't deny, there was no countermeasure ready. Just smoke. And silence. The TOW missile was never meant to fight alone. It was designed as part of something bigger. An American doctrine that didn't worship the tank, but saw the battlefield as an ecosystem. An environment where mobility, sensors, and precision mattered more than mass and brute armor, where killing power came not from size, but from reach, coordination, and timing. By the late 1980s, the U.S. military had woven the TOW missile into every level of its land combat strategy. It wasn't just in the hands of infantry squads anymore. It was mounted on helicopters, fast attack jeeps, Humvees, and most importantly, on the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. That changed everything. With the Bradley, TOWs gained mobility and armor, becoming part of mechanized columns that could keep pace with tanks, but strike from 3 times the range. The Bradley-TOW combination could accompany the M1 Abrams into combat, then split off to engage enemy armor before the M1 even fired its main gun. And they didn't need to win a duel. All they needed was one good shot. But it wasn't just about vehicles. American training made the TOW deadly. Crews drilled endlessly on firing procedures, range estimation, and shoot-and-scoot tactics. Operators were trained to fire from defilade, using hills, walls, or buildings as cover, and relocate within 30 seconds of launch. In simulations and live-fire exercises, TOW teams routinely destroyed multiple tanks before they were spotted, and when war came, the system delivered. During the 1991 Gulf War, TOW missiles helped annihilate Iraqi armored divisions equipped with Soviet T-55s, T-62s, and T-72s. In open desert, Bradley crews used TOWs to strike targets at over 3,000 meters. The Iraqi tanks, with outdated optics and limited turret traverse, never stood a chance. Most were destroyed before they ever returned fire. One Bradley crew reportedly destroyed 5 enemy tanks in under 3 minutes, maneuvering between shots and coordinating with scouts and air support. Another platoon used TOWs to neutralize an entire armored company attempting to retreat across open sand. In every case, the same principles applied. Fire from cover. Relocate. Fire again. But the true genius of the American system wasn't the missile, it was the network. TOW launchers didn't operate in isolation. They worked with reconnaissance drones, forward observers, and electronic warfare teams. If a Soviet-style tank column advanced, it didn't just face one ambush. It faced a web of threats: laser-guided artillery, GPS-coordinated airstrikes, and TOWs waiting in ravines, windows, and abandoned farmhouses. The result? Kill zones. Not random skirmishes, but engineered trap corridors where Soviet tactics, based on speed and overwhelming force, collapsed under their own weight. Once a lead tank was destroyed, the rest of the column bottlenecked. That's when the missiles came in waves: top-down, flank shots, and follow-ups. Some tank crews abandoned their vehicles before even taking a hit. And the TOW kept improving. By the early 2000s, the U.S. had fielded the TOW-2B Arrow, a top-attack variant that flew above the tank and detonated over the turret where armor was weakest. Even active protection systems struggled to stop it. The Soviets, and later the Russians, could not keep up with its modular upgrades. This was the truth Moscow never saw. The TOW wasn't a missile. It was a doctrine weapon, a thread in the American system of warfare that emphasized range over reaction, ambush over armor, and precision over power. The Soviets had built bigger tanks. The Americans had built a smarter battlefield. And in that battlefield, the TOW wasn't the underdog. It was the executioner. The TOW missile's moment of ultimate validation came in 1991, in the deserts of Iraq. Operation Desert Storm wasn't just a war, it was a live-fire laboratory, and in it, Soviet-built armor faced off against the full spectrum of American doctrine. At the center of that doctrine, riding quietly alongside the thunder of M1 Abrams tanks, were the TOW-armed M2 Bradleys. The target, the Iraqi Army's elite Republican Guard, equipped with Soviet T-72s and T-62s. Saddam Hussein had stocked his armored divisions with Soviet block machines, believing them to be battle-tested titans. His commanders trusted in the same principles the Soviets had taught: shock, mobility, and armor. But they didn't realize they were bringing Cold War tactics into a battlefield that had already evolved beyond them. In the early hours of the ground assault, U.S. mechanized infantry units swept into Iraqi-held territory. Bradley crews, trained to fire on the move, launched volleys of TOW missiles from kilometers away before Iraqi gunners even spotted them. The infrared optics on the TOWs painted glowing silhouettes of enemy tanks, even through sandstorms and darkness. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. In one engagement near the 73 Easting, a featureless grid line in the Iraqi desert, an American troop of 9 Bradleys and 12 Abrams tanks destroyed 70 enemy armored vehicles in under 23 minutes. The Bradleys fired over 50 TOWs in that single exchange. Iraqi tanks never returned accurate fire. Their turrets turned too slowly. Their optics were blind in the dust. And their armor? It might as well have been paper. Some Iraqi T-72s were destroyed from beyond their maximum effective range. Others were hit in flanks while attempting to reposition. A few were hit multiple times, TOWs blowing through ERA, setting off ammunition, ejecting turrets skyward in columns of fire. Soviet advisors, watching from afar, were stunned. This wasn't how the theory was supposed to work. The Republican Guard had followed the script, maneuvering in formation, using terrain, firing in volleys. But they were decimated before the script could even unfold. The TOW didn't just kill tanks. It killed time. It compressed battles into seconds. It made set-piece strategies irrelevant. And it forced armored crews to fight in fear, constantly scanning every ridge, every ruin, every highway overpass for the flash of a launch. In a single week, over 1,800 Iraqi tanks were destroyed. TOW missiles were responsible for hundreds of those kills. They outperformed expectations so completely that Pentagon analysts began reassessing what future warfare would look like. Because if a missile like this could do so much damage with so little cost, then maybe the tank wasn't the king of the battlefield anymore. The Soviets didn't need to send troops to the Gulf to feel the loss. They saw it on the TV, in the numbers, in the charred wrecks that once resembled their proudest machines, and they understood, with gut-punch clarity, that the thing they dismissed, the thing they thought couldn't pierce their armor, had just obliterated it. Not over months, but in minutes. What the TOW missile destroyed on the battlefield was devastating. But what it shattered in Soviet doctrine was far worse. Because after the dust of the Gulf War settled, after analysts pored over footage of destroyed T-72s, dismembered tank columns, and heat signature kill logs, a single truth emerged. The tank could no longer go anywhere without permission. Permission from what? From the battlefield itself. From the invisible hands of modern kill zones. From missiles like the TOW. For decades, the Soviet military was structured around the supremacy of armored assault. Tanks were the spearhead, the hammer, the engine of revolution and counterstrike. Everything, artillery, infantry, logistics, existed to support or exploit the shockwave a tank column could deliver. But now that model was dead, because no matter how fast, how thickly armored, or how well-trained a crew was, the TOW system had flipped the script. Infantry, once seen as secondary to armor, could now kill tanks at standoff distances with minimal risk. And that inversion didn't just require new weapons, it demanded an entirely new doctrine. Soviet planners were forced to confront questions they had never seriously considered. What happens when every open plain is a potential kill zone? What if your breakthrough unit is neutralized before it reaches the front? What if your armor, your most expensive, most feared asset, is now the most vulnerable thing you own? For a doctrine built on relentless forward momentum, this was intellectual ruin. It meant rethinking layered depth combat. It meant revising the relationship between mechanized units and infantry. It meant accepting that in the modern battlefield, a tank was not a hunter, but prey. Even worse, the TOW wasn't just a weapon. It was a strategy embedded in American command thinking, and that strategy emphasized flexibility, autonomy, real-time recon, and layered defense. It wasn't about having more tanks. It was about fielding fewer, smarter weapons that could coordinate across domains: air, ground, digital. This asymmetry is what truly defeated Soviet theory. A missile system that cost a fraction of a T-80 could kill it from miles away. A pair of soldiers with optics and a radio could stall an entire armored regiment. And even when the Soviets tried to replicate it, with their own ATGMs and reactive tactics, they couldn't match the networked integration that made the TOW so lethal. That failure wasn't just technological, it was ideological. Because the Soviet Union didn't just build tanks, it built its identity on them. And now, in the face of an American system that prized precision over steel, the very idea of the tank-led revolution crumbled. In the silence that followed the collapse, one truth echoed louder than any cannon. The TOW missile didn't just destroy Soviet tanks, it destroyed the myth of their invincibility. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding collapse. Economies faltered. Ideologies faded. But on the modern battlefield, the legacy of that era still echoes, especially in the dust trails of burned-out tanks and the wire-guided trails of a missile that reshaped war. Today, the TOW missile is still in service. It has been upgraded, adapted, exported. In Syria, it made headlines once more, used by rebel fighters against Soviet-era armor, often supplied by Russia itself. Video after video showed the same pattern. A silent launch, a 20-second flight, and then fire erupting from a turret as yet another tank was turned into molten debris. Decades after the Soviets dismissed it, the TOW was still proving them wrong. In Ukraine, Fears of Russian armored advances once again revived conversations around portable anti-tank systems. While newer missiles like Javelins made headlines, veterans and tacticians alike remembered what came before and how the TOW had set the standard. But perhaps the most haunting part of this legacy isn't just in hardware. It's in the realization that warfare had changed under the Soviets' feet, and they never recognized it. They built cathedrals of steel, imagining thunderous charges and heroic clashes of armor. What they got instead were missiles in the dark, fired by shadows, ending battles before they began. To this day, the wreckage remains. Rusting T-72s lie scattered across the deserts of Iraq. In fields across Eastern Europe, decommissioned Soviet tanks sit like ghosts, monuments to a doctrine that couldn't evolve fast enough. And in every war room that still plans for armor, one thought remains unspoken, but deeply understood. Missiles don't fear tanks. The TOW was never glamorous. It never had the silhouette of a fighter jet or the roar of a cannon. But it earned something far more lasting: respect. Because it taught the world that dominance doesn't always come from the biggest machine.